Hello, everyone. I'm Bella Webb. I'm the sustainability editor at Vogue Business. And we are going to be talking about the just transition today in the context of our very complex and constantly shifting global supply chains. There will be time for questions at the end. There will be a QR code that comes up, and we're doing questions via Slido. So make a note of any questions you have to ask our panel, and I'll give you a warning of a couple of minutes at the end to send them in. Now, let's introduce our panelists, and hopefully by the time I get to the end, everyone will be here. So, first up, we have Camila Villas, who is the program officer at the International Trade Center, which has a joint mandate from the World Trade Organization and the United Nations Trade and Development Team. Next up, we have Professor Dilys Williams, who is the founder and director of the Center for Sustainable Fashion at London College of Fashion. Next, we have Prama Bhardwaj, who is the CEO and founder of blank apparel manufacturing company Mantis World and partner to SUNFLAG Tanzania, the first African factory to become GOTS certified. And finally, here we are, we have Lakshmi Poti, who is the head of fashion at the LAUDES Foundation, a global grant-making and impact organization working on the just transition to a green economy. Thank you all for joining us. So, before we dive into this topic, which is obviously quite a complex one, let's sort of make sure everyone is on the same page. So, Lakshmi, I'm going to come to you first. Can you tell us what we mean by a just transition in the context of fashion supply chains?
Sounds good. I'm going to test this. Can everybody hear me? Super. Hi, everyone. This is lovely to kick off a session on future fabrics with a panel on just transition, which is, I think, an absolutely critical conversation we need to have. So really grateful to the Future Fabrics team for this. So what we mean at LAUDES Foundation, at least, we think it's important to ground the definition of just transition or the messaging of it within largely common international processes. So for example, the ILO defines just transition as a way to green the economy in a manner that's inclusive and fair as possible to everyone concerned. So when it comes to the fashion supply chain, the question to ask is, who is the everyone? Who are the people involved across the supply chain, and how are they impacted? And that's where we begin the piece around just transition. So when you talk about decarbonizing the fashion supply chain, when you talk about it becoming more circular in an efficient way, in a manner that's, fast-paced and with urgency, it's also making sure that you're not leaving folks behind and impacting everybody concerned across the supply chain in a manner that's, it's leaving them better off than before. So that's how we look at just transition fashion.
Yeah, thank you. And so this concept of nobody left behind, that's normally the sort of, if you need a 2-second intro to a just transition, that's the key. Camila, can you set the scene for us? How does this relate to the international trade landscape? Because there are so many changes happening right now. Tell us why it's important to bring these two conversations together and why international trade is currently putting a just transition in such a precarious position.
Right. Well, first, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the just transition in the global supply chain now, it's precarious because producers are facing multiple pressures from multiple sides, and also they are being at the same time asked to invest in more sustainability focused practices. And we see rising compliance costs, increasing climate shocks, inflations. We have disruptions as well in the trade routes. And for many of producers, and we work a lot with SMEs, they don't have a lot of, especially in the global south actually, they don't have this bargaining power. They are very squeezed in margins, so they don't have much room for negotiation. So I think that's why it's super important to bring these two conversations together because the trade frameworks, they can enable a just transition, but sometimes unintentionally they can also create new barriers. So I think if new sustainability rules like traceability or carbon measures, if they are introduced without considering the realities of these SMEs, it can be more, it can increase inequality instead of bringing sustainability and responsibility to the supply chain.
Dilys, as Camila said, a lot of these transitions require a shift in the dynamic in supply chains. So rather than suppliers being squeezed, having no margins to make transitions, we're talking about giving them a voice at the table, giving them agency in the decisions that affect them. But investing in those sort of long-term partnerships is something that fashion is quite hesitant to do, or has historically been. And in the context of, everything that's happening with Trump's tariffs, the geopolitical instability in the world right now, a lot of brands are looking for very agile supply chains. They want short-term partnerships and they want to diversify rather than investing in one place. How do we kind of balance those motives? How do we make it more appealing for businesses to invest in these long-term, more relational supply chain partnerships?
Yeah. Thank you, Bella. And yes, I'd also like to say thank you for everybody being here, and how exciting it is that, Future Fashion Expo, 15 years. So that gives me hope. Yes, it's very complex, and not just fashion, but society, culture, economies are set up. The infrastructures are for short-termism, for businesses, for governments, even for universities. But there are lots of ways in which we can already see that people are holding their nerve, and that's what we've got to do most, hold our nerve. And it's got to be on lots of different levels. Unfortunately, there's no financial incentive at the moment for any business to do good. But there's a moral and an ethical incentive, and we see that with a lot of small businesses, as you say, even with some large businesses. Quite a lot of family-owned businesses, even really big ones, do feel a long-termism imperative. And nature and society are assets to any business, and without them there's no business. And so I think people who do take that into consideration are the people that are going to be here for the long term. But lots of businesses only think about the short term because they move on. So it has to be lots of different levels. We do need government legislation. We're having Mary Cray, Minister for Nature now, the extended producer responsibility, things like that are all coming in. So whilst it feels like a really precarious moment, and apparently is it called the VUCA moment or VUCA moment?
Is that what we're
Volatile,
calling it?
uncertain, complex, and ambiguous.
Oh gosh!
Apparently that's what we're living in.
We've got an acronym.
We've got a new acronym. I'm going to say this. I think that what's really incredibly important is education around the knowledge and skills about a just transition, about a well-being economy, so that we factor in not just profit from an economic perspective, but from a social, cultural, and environmental perspective. And we do see that a lot more people are doing that. Some people are doing it voluntarily, things like the Fashion Pact. I was speaking to Eva last night, but voluntarily is not enough. Government is not enough. Moral is not enough. We've got to do all of these things. Training and education is not enough in itself, but collected together and holding our nerve, then over 15 years of this, I've seen amazing people coming through, some people that are showing here. So my message is hold our nerve.
Okay, hold our nerve. You mentioned the financial incentives, and I think that's crucially important, how we redistribute both risk and reward in fashion supply chains. Prama, what kind of examples have you seen of risk and reward being redistributed? How can we role model this for big brands? What does it look like?
Thank you, Bella. I'm just going to add my thanks to Future Fabrics Expo for having me here. It's a real pleasure and an honor. And thank you to Camila and ITC who have sponsored us as SUNFLAG Tanzania to be here. So thank you. It's a really good question about risk and reward, and typically in the global supply chains for fashion, and probably most supply chains, all the reward happens at one end of the supply chain at the brand and retailer level, and all the risk gets pushed up to the other end of the supply chain. And the further you go back onto the supply chain, all the way back in our case to the cotton farmers, the more the risk is. So there's been a huge imbalance for years, and that's typically, I would say, because we live in a globalized economy where products and goods have been treated as commodities, where you can have hot flows of finance and purchasing going to the next cheapest location, essentially selling as cheap labor to people who do not have the power to hold their own at the table. So how do we change that? Well, from what we've done at SUNFLAG Tanzania, which has been it's been quite unique in how it works. It's intergenerational, built by my grandfather in the 1960s. employs about half the workforce are women. And the differences are that we look at things slightly differently. We have that long-term approach. And we're not completely reliant on the global north for purchasing, where there's a lot of regional trade that happens within the continent of Africa. And by being completely vertical, you also hold a lot of that supply chain in one place. So being able to actually say no sometimes to the wrong kind of order or the wrong kind of customer, no matter how attractive it may look, because you're thinking long term, is really important. And I think, just picking up on everything that we've heard about, like, climate shocks, trade shocks, actually, I would argue that for business to invest in local, regional sourcing landscapes is really important, because that creates a resilient supply chain. We don't know if there's a drought, if there's a flood, if there's wildfires. How are businesses going to be able to safeguard their supply chains? It's only through transparency, knowing what their local landscape looks like, investing in it. So I think there are many levers and factors to look at about how to rebalance the risk and the reward.
Lakshmi, I want to come to you now. How do we make sure that every stakeholder group that is affected by these decisions has a voice in the conversation, and not just a voice in the conversation, but agency to make decisions that will directly affect them?
I think, so the real sort of principles of inclusion, agency, and accountability, if you were to look at those three aspects to sort of prepare for a just transition, a place-based context is then so important. Because if you have to, and I think Prama just talked about that as well, locally relevant contexts, how do you bring a multi-stakeholder approach into this conversation? And that requires you to look at it from a locally relevant piece. So for example, let me give you something around parametric insurance and the work with suppliers in supply chains. This is something that Climate for Resilience for All is a partner of ours who's worked with SEVA in India to bring about a parametric insurance product, looking at the sort of heat waves that are happening today and how these insurance products need to come in. And this requires also inputs from those impacted and those affected in a particular region, and the voices of those who can actually be, who are going to have this affected. So the work of SEVA works with women in India, for example, and this actually brings suppliers on board as well. So we talk about supplier margins being squeezed. We talk about those in the middle of the supply chain. So you have the brands on one end with the demands, with the commitments, but then you don't have, things fall through the cracks in the middle with the suppliers not being equipped. So how do you bring all of them to the table? Another example is actually work that we're doing in Tanzania and 3 other geographies called the Regenerative Production Landscape Collaboratives. This actually looks at farmers and bringing them to the table and giving them the voice to talk about what does impact actually mean to them. So we have a transition of wanting to move to sustainable cotton, whatever that may be in terms of a certification. But what does that actually mean for that particular region? What does impact mean? Is it water? Is it deforestation? Is it better incomes? And this is so important to ground it at the local level. And this is how you're going to be, you're going to be able to actually track who the everyone is, who needs to be at that table to actually have this conversation, and then solve for it accordingly. Otherwise, the transition is just going to be more tokenistic, and we're never going to actually be inclusive at the end of the day.
We're going to come back to this idea of place-based and context-specific solutions in a minute. But I just want to pick up on this idea of different stakeholder groups being involved in the decision-making process. One area that, a lot of suppliers are being affected by right now that they haven't really had much of a say in the decision-making for is the new regulations coming into play. And compliance is a huge challenge for a lot of suppliers. Camila, for both brands and suppliers, this is a challenge. How do we raise standards without placing such a huge burden on players up and down the supply chain?
Well, tricky question. I think raising standards is really essential, but how we do it is just as important. We have been seeing a lot of suppliers struggling to comply to multiple audits, to multiple requests, to multiple systems, because what we see is that brands and retailers, they don't have a harmonized ask in terms of compliance. So we have been trying to address this as we don't see harmonization happening so quickly. We work with the suppliers so they can collect data more effectively. So at the end, they are becoming like data experts in a way, which I think it's important also for them to bring them to the table, but also for them to understand why this is important. So it's not only to comply to these brands, but also to set their CSR standards, and also eventually, of course, to comply to the new DPP rules. So I think it's super important. I thought about three things. One is the harmonization. The second is capacity investment. So then phase timelines and technical support is there as well. And then, of course, stronger partnerships, what we have been speaking about, so that brands and retailers, they build long-term relationships with these suppliers. We see that these SMEs, they are more than capable to meet the standards, but they really need the incentives and also this collaboration and this partnership so they can comply, but it also benefits them.
I want to come back to you, Prama, because it was either you or Lakshmi mentioned earlier the climate change stresses, and specifically heat stress, which a lot of suppliers are already dealing with. So at the same time as dealing with international trade fluctuations and the compliance landscape that Camila's been describing, there is the very real and very present challenge of climate change and extreme weather, which is intensifying. How are you seeing this play out in Tanzania, and what could your sort of approach teach us about adaptation and mitigation and the role of those things in a just transition?
I think that's a great question, and it's kind of exactly what we've just been talking about in Tanzania. So we work with organic and regenerative cotton projects. I was out in the farms last year, and it was quite incredible how you can see by switching how you farm the land from extractive and conventional methods into regenerative organic methods, you're saving on water, you're creating a more resilient soil, more resilient communities, and actually that has an impact on climate. So, the thing is, I think we all know this. We have the answers. We know what the answers are. We just need to get on and do them and not try and have a simple black and white strategy that fits for every single landscape, but really go into that specific local landscape and say, right, what are the answers here? And then figure out how we implement them.
Lakshmi, are you able to expand on the heat stress point specifically? Because I think this is one area where maybe a just transition comes into conflict with decarbonisation targets. How are you seeing suppliers deal with that?
Yeah, so I think this is, again, what I talked about, the parametric insurance product as an example. It's really come to be because one is I don't think it's an adaptation versus mitigation, right? It's a holistic conversation that we need to start having, and I think it's the time now. So suppliers, yes, are being demanded to sort of, move into decarbonization plans, but at the same time, there's worker productivity loss, there's heats in places like Dhaka and Delhi, almost 50 degrees, it's unheard of. So it's about, and I come back again to the place-based conversation here, because it's understanding and empathizing what are the requirements in that particular region. And for then brands to set up long-term relationships with their suppliers to say, okay, we understand and we need to co-create and co-develop the action plan here. What's happening now is transition plans are being made at a very global level and then sort of just, sent down to suppliers. Doesn't matter if you're in Vietnam, Bangladesh, India. But the needs of these regions are so different. The needs of the suppliers are so different. The sort of policies that already support them are so different in each of these regions. So how do you get finance, capital providers, policies to enable suppliers in those regions so that they can then actually be better for the workers who are working in those factories? And all of this will require them to develop solutions together with the brands again. So I keep coming back to the place-based realities, but then that is what it is. It is contextual, and you need to start breaking it into that. So the heat stress, what are the products required? Who are the insurers? Who are the financial providers in those particular geographies? And what do they need to create? What sorts of products do they need to create that are contextual for that region is extremely important. So there's actually a partner of ours who's done a report and research on certain geographies in the world and how heat and climate change will impact factories and therefore what can be done. So I think more of that needs to come out, and research needs to move into action now to implementing through solutions and co-developed, co-created products with suppliers who really know what they're doing.
So in order to keep these communication pathways open between brands and suppliers and all of the various other stakeholder groups involved, we need governance structures, right? And Dilys, this is where I want to bring you back in, because I know CSF has been working on governance for tomorrow, so future governance structures. What can you tell us about some of the different approaches out there and how governance can be a tool for positive change?
Yeah, I didn't think as a designer that this would be where I'd be working, looking at governance, but it's really interesting and vital. So we've been working with Caring for 10 years, long-term partnership. We've done lots of work around materials development, some have been shown here, product development, etc. But we kept hitting a wall because, however much we wanted to amplify that work, we were being drowned out by all of the powers against it. So we decided that, we've been talking about it just now, the fingers get pointed down the value chain. Actually, we need to move our gaze up to the boards in businesses and look at what their knowledge and skills are. And we did some background research and found out that a lot of boards don't actually know what good looks like. They don't know whether or not they're doing a good job. They have some awareness and they've made commitments all over the place, but they haven't actually taken the action for all sorts of reasons, some of which are about not wanting to let go of power. But what we've done is we've got a 3-year project. We're at the end of year 1. It's incredibly challenging, but we have convened people, as you were just talking about, from across the value chain, but also from across generations, from across locations, and also people that have an expertise of more than human perspectives. So we've taken this as 3I justice: interspecies, intergenerational, and intergenerational. And how do the knowledges that are held, some in academia, a lot outside academia, actually inform and can be informed by current boards? So we did a design process which included empathizing with the current board and their pushes and pulls. So you don't want to be naive to say, oh, this is how it needs to be, without understanding. People who are on current boards feel as if it's impossible to do otherwise. So it's kind of, how do you bring these people together to understand each other's tensions, and to understand the power imbalance, and to then kind of co-create a way so that the decisions that are being made at board level are ones that are taking the more than human, the intergenerational and intergenerational perspectives in mind. It's not easy. It's actually probably the most difficult project we've ever run, but it feels necessary. And we've had some amazing people. We've got a sort of constellation of a group of researchers from different disciplines, an advisory board who've worked across these spaces. We've got what's called a stewardship board, because we took the notion of this idea of going from governance to stewardship. And I mean, even Milton Friedman talked about profit, but with an ethical and societal understanding of balance. So, this idea of profit at any cost is not something that is a sort of mantra that anybody can live by. So we're looking at it from a philosophical perspective, but also the sort of principles, the processes, and the people that need to be involved in decision making at governance level. Sorry, I could talk about it all day. It's interesting and challenging, and we're really open to anybody who is working in this space, interested in working in this space, to talk to us, because I'm learning a lot.
I am also learning a lot on this panel, but I'm aware of the time. So, audience, this is your 5-minute warning for the Q&A. You've got the Slido QR code, which maybe will come back up in a minute, I'm hoping. It's been there the whole time. There it is. Okay, so Slido QR code, send in your questions. You've got 5 minutes, and then we're going to come to you. In the meantime, let's come back to this concept of place-based and context-specific solutions, because it's come up a few times. It's very important. I'm going to sort of go along the line. Can you all tell me what this looks like? So when we're talking about context-specific place-based solutions, can you give us some examples of how varied and diverse that can be, and maybe what it looks like in your specific area?
Yes,
Camila,
of
do you want to
course.
start?
Yes, sure. So we work globally in multiple countries, and here we are representing the UK sponsored program, which is called the United Kingdom Trade Partnerships. So there we work in 4 countries in textiles: Nepal, Tanzania, Madagascar, and Ethiopia. And just by working in the field, you can see that it's impossible to have a solution that fits all. So a few examples in Tanzania, for example, we are now working for them. They have these large factories which were cater more to the US market, where they have larger volumes. And now we are helping them to adapt to this production capacity, remaining efficient, but producing smaller batches. And then if we move to Tanzania, it's very different, because there they have capacity and they produce larger orders for their own continent. So with them, we work with lean manufacturing, but in a totally different system. It's still the same principle, lean manufacturing, but it's very different the way we work in Ethiopia and in Tanzania. And then if we look in Nepal, for example, we are working with cashmere producers, so from the farm level up until the finished garment. So we cannot apply, of course, the same principles to that specific location where herders, they are Buddhists, and we sensitize them even in the basic principle of like combing the goats and really sharing with them that they will not harm the goats. So I think it's really difficult if you want to have one rule that fits all, because it will not fit all.
I did
Sorry
say
that
we'll
I
go
went
along the
all
line,
over
but
the place.
let's zigzag a little bit, since you
Yeah.
mentioned Tanzania. Prama, I'm going to come to you next.
Yeah, I think context and place-based interventions are super, super important, but it also goes across industries. So, and it goes across value chains. So the first thing is transparency. You need to know exactly where everything that you have comes from and look at that particular landscape. So for Tanzania, for us, it's very easy. We have a very big vertical factory. We know exactly where everything comes from. We work closely with trade unions. It's very different from when I go and visit factories in Bangladesh, for example. I'll go in there and like there's women coming off the sewing floor coming to say hi and asking how my grown-up children are and how my parents, and it's for me that's a very community-based feel, which is really important when we talk about people. In terms of the context for landscape, so we went and visited our farms, our organic farms in Tanzania, and really looking at, again, across industries, how does the food and how does the fiber industry work together in a particular landscape? So, for example, all the organic cotton is certified. Hopefully they'll find markets for it, but we use rotational cover crops. Or for example, the cashew nuts are just sold as conventional product on the market, even though they've had the same, love put to them towards organic and regenerative principles. So really looking at a landscape context. I'm currently advising on a new initiative called Guarana, which is really about that, about looking at a particular landscape. So we might look at a very limited area, look at which actors are in there. There could be cotton, there could be food, there could be mining. What is the community needing? What is the government doing? You have to look at all these aspects, and it's not easy, and you can't use like a one size fits all approach, but it's essential. And I'll come back to this again. Like if businesses want to have supply chains they can rely on, they will have to invest in the context of their supply chains and local environment. And we're seeing that happen more and more in Tanzania.
Dilys, I'm going to come to you
Thank
next.
you. Yeah, I mean, the reason I set up Centre Sustainable Fashion was because the disconnect that was happening even in my own lifetime, between actually understanding the decisions I was making as a designer and who were affected, and also learning from the people that I was working with. So I think, this idea of plural knowledges and not just expecting to be teaching other people. So opening things up. I mean, our courses, the online courses that we have got a model where people are learning from each other and they share with each other, rather than a group of academics kind of saying this is how to do it and marking the work kind of thing. So I think that breaking down of that power dynamic and the hierarchy is really important in education. I think also, most businesses are small. So, the local and contextualized element of what it means to be a small business means you do understand, as you said, the relationships involved, and that you're speaking people to people. But even if you're in a design team in a really big business, there are if you can find out how much something costs, you can actually find out what it is that you're doing. And we are seeing more and more design teams actually having a greater connection with where they're working and how they can, whether it's online or going for visits or immersive sessions, that it's a sharing of knowledges, because knowing about the land, knowing about community and what's going on is where the richness of understanding comes. And so I think we've become really disconnected from a knowledge perspective and thinking we can just read something online. Yeah. But the relationships that you have face to face, informally, sitting down, eating food together, as well as when you're working together, that's kind of the richness of what it means to be a creative. So I think there is hope there that this can happen. And yes, everybody's busy, everybody's got deadlines, everybody's got targets, but we find that in some businesses you can just take one move to the left or the right, where maybe the left that can help in some way. So there's something that everybody can do, whether you feel as if you're kind of powerless or whether you're working directly with it in a farm. Yeah. And more designers are working directly in the soil with the earth. So that changes what it means to be a designer, I think.
Lakshmi, I'm going to give you the final word and then we're going to go to questions. Tell us more about context-specific solutions.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to give you two examples here. One is perhaps of Bangladesh. As we all know, it's an absolutely important geography for textile production at large. And there's something there that we're hoping to get off the ground by the end of the year, which is around a Just Transition Center. And like Prama said, it requires you to look at a cross-sectoral view. So yes, apparel. There's also construction that's, kind of picking up in Bangladesh. So what happens when you talk about an entire country perhaps being being left behind in this new sort of transition planning exercise? And this is where we have the opportunity to actually design and co-develop with a lot of stakeholders. So there's policymakers, there's the finance providers, there's the suppliers themselves, there's the workers, and there's also cross-sectoral view. So there's apparel suppliers, there's also the real estate and construction folks on the table. And this is important because it's also a country where there's a large sort of youth coming into employment. So what's their take? How do you transition a country like this going forward? And so this requires, obviously, nuances and an understanding of what's happening on the ground. Another example I can give you is really around circularity. The fashion industry is moving quicker to sort of demand products that are recycled and all of that. But what we often forget is waste workers who are informal, who are completely hidden, who are not part of the fashion supply chain today. But in creating a circular supply chain going forward, what happens to these people? How are they brought into the fashion supply chain as well? And here I can give you an example of India, which has the full textiles chain. But how do you bring waste workers in there? What's the social protections for them? How do they get integrated? But also an example in a place like Ghana, which for decades has always been a recipient of textile waste. But with the EU laws on EPR, etc., the conversations there, they aren't in these conversations. So what happens to these communities? How do they, what's happening in their transition through all of this? There's going to be more investments in the EU. That's great. But what then happens to a Ghana? Are they going to get the investments as well? What do the communities there require? What sort of investments, what sort of infrastructure? How do you scale them up to also be part of the transition? Or are they going to be left behind? So this is all, this is really connecting the deep local context to larger global conversations that are happening on policies, on finance. But truly, to create that systems change and a just transition, you need the dots to connect
Yeah.
across.
Okay, so we're going to come to the audience, and actually there's one here that I think leads on quite nicely from what you've just been saying, Lakshmi. Can we hear more about how philanthropic funders and investors are collaborating to fund locally contextualized solutions and long-term supply chain relationships?
Yes.
I think that's probably one for you.
So I think one of the examples I just mentioned on the Bangladesh just transition, I think philanthropy, and we recognize that no one business can do this alone. This is a hard challenge. It's also often doing things that are unproven or don't have a business case today. So that's where I think the critical role of philanthropy to come in and cultivate alliances that are otherwise unlikely. So it's really to bring, yes, brands on the table and suppliers. Sure, that's a supply chain. But how do you get policymakers? How do you get others who are not really in the know of what's happening in the supply chain at the same table? I think that's a critical one that I think philanthropy can continue to play a role. And it's really also in demonstrating. So these are the ones that you need to de-risk early on, and there needs to be proof points and demonstrations. So an example I can think of again is the regenerative production landscapes, where over 10 years we worked with partners in India, Tanzania, Brazil, and Pakistan, different contexts, to really show what's required. And we now have 1 million hectares and 300,000 farmers covered. And I think it's the right time now to start making this case for investors to come in and say, look, there are actually small businesses in these landscapes. There is a business case that can be sort of proven. And here are the test beds that have been created. And that's, again, the role of philanthropy, to look at that as part of the transition. And the last one I'd say is, again, on the suppliers piece. The suppliers, again, in the middle of the supply chain, specifically tier 2 and tier 3, are absolutely cut off and disconnected from the brands, and are also required or expected to take up low carbon materials or water change or whatever it may be. So there's lots and lots of demands coming at them slightly differently from different brands. Philanthropy can again come in there to create that pre-competitive collaboration and alliance, to say, well, this is for all, this is a collaboration required, and in a way play that neutral role and bring investors in as well. So that's, I would say, critical roles of philanthropy.
Thank you. There's a question here about overproduction, and I think it's a really interesting one because it's often the question I get when I write about degrowth, for example, or the need to curb overproduction. It's this question of, well, what about the jobs? And in the context of a just transition, that is a particularly loaded question. So I'm going to bring together a couple of different questions here into one, which is essentially, how do we deal with overproduction without undermining a just transition? Who wants to jump in? It's a big one.
Well,
Camila?
yeah. So we have just launched a report called Under the Banyan Tree, which is quite interesting. It was the ITC together with the International Apparel Association really diving into this and addressing how overproduction can be, I mean, how you can diminish a little bit overproduction. But what we found out is that the companies, they need a very agile supply chain, and therefore buyers, they commit a lot of errors in this in between because they need to do quick and a lot of units at the same time. So if buyers, meaning brands, work together with the supply chain, if they can anticipate the needs and also decrease the funnel of the amount of raw materials that they are using, they can then work with the supply chain, have the raw material ready, but only place the order once they have tested a little bit the supply chain and the market to see, not the supply chain, but the market to see if the products are going well. So in some is to have work with less raw materials, with less styles, test the market before placing the bigger production order. But this, it will only happen if the supply chain works together with the fashion brand and if they know that the order is coming and the raw material is in-house. So that's the test we are running now, and we have this report that was just released.
Anyone else want to jump in on that, Dilys?
Thank you. Yeah, very big question. But I think, firstly, it has to be lots of different things at once that are going to change it. And also we have to remember that how things are now is not how they will be in the future. It wasn't in the past. And let's not wait until climate disaster and more social disasters happen before it changes. But it will change. But strong unionisation, the conversation that you had at Copenhagen Fashion Week last week, giving the agency to workers and unionisation rights. At the same time, we've got to have NGOs right across the spectrum being supported to be able to do good work. But I think also that we do need to change that culture, and culture change can happen actually quite quickly. We're already seeing suffocation. We're already seeing that people feel as if they're overwhelmed. We know that there's mental health issues to do with overconsumption. So there's lots of things coming in at different levels, and the bubble will burst. Also, price rises and volatility, the VOGUE, that will change things. So let's be to be in business, we need to be ahead of that. But the only way that it'll be a just transition is if there's strong unionisation, so that when things do change, like the tariffs changing overnight, it's not a change that affects the people that are the most vulnerable. So that is absolutely critical. But we all have a role to play in the responsibility for, what we say at Sustainable Fashion is, what would the earth have us do, and what would the most vulnerable person in the world have us do, and how can we be attentive to what's going on for those people, and for all of us, we've got that responsibility to be attentive to it. But it's got to be legislation as well, and it's got to be global agreement around governments of the rights of people. So it is happening, but we really have got to keep pushing much harder and stand up against the stuff that we can't stand by. Because if we want to be in the fashion sector, we can't stand by and watch this happen and still feel good about our jobs.
There are a couple of questions about this, and I think we've probably given some strands of answers, but let's kind of sum it all up together. And I want to pass this one over to you, Prama, because I suppose in your position, you're kind of the interface between the top and the bottom of the supply chain, between upstream and down. How do you make the business case for a just transition? We've been talking a lot about the humanity in it, the nature need for a just transition, but a lot of people are up against, shareholders that want to maximize profits. Like, how do you make the business case here?
Wow, I could talk a lot about capitalism and the failure of it, but I think it's very difficult to shoehorn a system of a just transition as a concept into a system that is so narrow as to look at only shareholder returns. So again, it comes back to humans. At the end of the day, boards, companies, factories, farmers, what we have is a shared humanity. And hopefully we all care about the next generation. And so it's really appealing. And I've actually seen this happen when I've spoken to some American companies who are very much, we love what you do, Prama, but no one's going to pay for it. There's no customer demand. And when you really start breaking it down to say, actually, I care about my children. Do you? And it's quite hard to then come against that. But that's a difficult one. I accept that. The business case really, again, is about risk. So shareholders are going to be interested, on the one hand, maximize profit, on the other hand, minimize risk. So if you can push moving into a just transition, into de-risking your supply chain and your long-term future business, then that is a way to go in a conventional capitalist sense without appealing to the common humanity. And I think I would just finish, because I know we're nearly out of time, but just say, I love this line I heard, is that resilience is the new return on investment. Just put it that way.
I think that is a very good note to end on. Resilience is the new return on investment. Thank you all for your insights. Thank you to our audience for your very thoughtful questions. I think we're all done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bella.
Thank you, Bella.
Okay.